CSRD is coming from. So how do you run it then? We've defined 4 phases here, or 4 steps, if you like. Going from setup to collect, which is really the data collection there, putting things together, to doing the analysis, and then reporting what you've done and how you've done it. So 4 broad steps with each their subcomponents. We'll go through each one of these 4 in a little bit more detail, and I'll take you through those subcomponents, how some of those subcomponents really apply to your business to make it fit for purpose is really more of a tailored deep dive that you really need to work out. And we'll talk a little bit at the end of the webinar about finding the right solution that's right-sized for your organization. Across these 4 stages, there's 2 things I want you to keep in mind: process and methodology. As you go, record everything you do. And this is really important. So document all the considerations, the stakeholders you've involved, the methodology you've used, the sources you've tapped, anything. The more you can document from, step 1 till step 4, the better. Because in the end, if you look at stage 4 there, you'll see describe the process and report the outcomes. Now, back in the day, maybe report the outcome was the focus area. That's what we're going for. And describing the process was not that important. But today, it is equally important. And CSRD, as well as GRI, are really putting a very strong emphasis on show me how you got there. So think back when you're in a classroom, you provided the right answer to the teacher, and he said, well, how did you get there? Show me how you got to that answer. Show me how you got to your material topics. Demonstrate how you've engaged your stakeholders, what your considerations were. And that's something I cannot stress enough. Document and describe the process transparently. Now, stakeholder engagement is always a big question around doing a double materiality or materiality assessment. How do you engage stakeholders, but mostly when and where? The key answer is really you'll engage stakeholders across the way, across the whole process. Every step of the way, there's some stakeholder you might be engaging with. So you do see that in step 2, there is stakeholder engagement. And it's really important to put that in there as a component. But that doesn't mean in step 1, 3, and 4, you're not engaging with some internal or maybe external stakeholders. So it's really important to keep that front of mind, document the process and the methodology, and consider every step of the way, which stakeholders should I engage here? So with that, let's jump into that first component, the setup here. Now, this is the most steps in here. So this is the really kind of making sure you start off right. The first one is really important. That is internal alignment. So you're going to run your double materiality assessment, but is that just you? Are you responsible? And are you the person? Are you, a lone ranger running this? Or can you establish a task force or a sustainability committee? And can you get cross-functional engagement? The broader, the better. And it's really important to get that ownership across the business, because that gets you a lot more engagement from your internal stakeholders, a lot more understanding, and much better quality insights. So setting up a committee at the start there that helps you run ESG or sustainability, or just maybe materiality with people from across the business is really a prerequisite almost to really doing a quality materiality assessment. Now, with them, work out who are all our stakeholders, internal and external. So come up with that stakeholder mapping. To whom is this important? And that will then kind of also really be relevant for the next step, value chain assessment. But also consider who are your silent stakeholders. And what we often mean with that is the stakeholders that, don't have clear representation, like nature or future generations. Now, often you can find, the traditional groups of stakeholders quite easily through your communications, your investor relations, procurement, HR. So don't start from scratch. Get the lists and the groups already out there and evolve those functions and departments to really do that mapping. To help with that mapping, do a value chain assessment. So look at upstream, core, and downstream activities and capture all those activities, not just to map your stakeholders, but to really get a sense of what is your entire value chain. Because what we're going to do in phase 2 is really look for each of those activities across the value chain. What are the sustainability topics and the impacts and risks and opportunities? So make sure here that you engage with your functional heads or the key internal stakeholders to work out what are those components and activities that we have across that entire value chain. Think about your materiality thresholds. So define a sound materiality methodology and clearly record that methodology at the start. You don't want to end up with going through this whole exercise and then ending up with a list of 20 topics and you don't know where to cut them. You're just going to say, oh, just pick the top 10 topics, work out where you set those red lines that we looked at earlier. If you work that out from the start, at the end, you'll see automatically what becomes material or not. And talk to finance or your leadership team, because finance might have some experience in setting, from a finance accounting perspective, thresholds, and leadership might have some views on where they want to set those boundaries. Another really key component at the start of the setup is think about education and change management. Identify relevant education initiatives that might need to take place to make sure there's really a sense of organizational ownership of ESG, understanding of ESG, and why you're doing this exercise. So make sure, like I said at the start, that there is this cross-functional understanding of doing a materiality assessment. This is why we're doing it. It really drives engagement. If you're inviting people to do a survey or an interview or come to a workshop around materiality, if they already know that this process is happening and why it's happening, that helps a lot. And then get your key internal stakeholders there. Get the word out through your comms team and HR. Talk to leadership, how they can push the message down. Talk to your investor relations, how they can talk to your external stakeholders. So there's a lot happening in this setup phase, and there might be even more components, but these are the key things to really think about. The next phase then is data collection, really looking at what are those sustainability topics that are relevant to us. So I'm not going to say material yet. In this phase, we're not going to determine if something is material. That is when you start analyzing in the next phase. Right now, we're really interested in a long list of all relevant sustainability matters and use your value chain mapping for that. So across each of those upstream core business activities and downstream, look at where are potentially sustainability areas and link them to the IROs, the impacts, risks, and opportunities, and just list all of them. It's recommended you start with impacts because impacts often automatically lead to risks and opportunities. But also then, once you've gone through all the impacts and the associated risks and opportunities, think, are there any risks and opportunities that might not be related to an impact? And capture everything. Use your leadership, your functional heads, external stakeholders, whoever you need to get that long list of your IROs and your relevant sustainability matters. And check that with your stakeholders. Engage stakeholder groups through this. So use your stakeholder mapping to work out at what stage are you going to get from what group inputs. Collect additional IROs or sustainability matters from your stakeholders. And use third-party data sources and information and expertise to really shape those lists as well. Now, these things, I've highlighted those 4 actions here in yellow because these 4 actions are not sequential. They're almost like intertwined. They're really happening at the same time and they reinforce each other. So it might be that you start out with your business activities and think about the impacts and then look at this impact we identify to one of our core production processes. It's an impact on the world, it's a negative impact, and with that there's a risk. We also see an opportunity out of that. And this is in what sustainability area? This is around climate, around carbon emissions. So that's one way of doing it. But you can also start with some of those sustainability matters that you believe are already relevant to your business and think about the impacts, the risks and opportunities you're facing. Maybe you use some third-party data. So you could be using research, scientific research or industry group research where you see what are your competitors reporting on and start with that. So you really want to, have these 4 actions reinforce each other, that you end up with a long list of topics and IROs that has been checked with stakeholders. What do they believe is most important? What are their views? What have they added to this? Then you do the analysis of that data. So you're going to score those IROs. You're going to look at, what has the highest impact there. So the best thing to do is figure out what is a fit for purpose approach here. So how are you going to use more qualitative insights you've learned maybe from interviews And maybe you've done surveys and got scores on particular topics, so the quantitative methodology, and describe that. Again, in that process, describe how you're doing that. Once you've done that, applied scores to your data set, look at your criteria that you set and the thresholds that you set at that very first stage there. And that enables you then to quite easily consolidate your material IROs and sustainability topics. So this is where you go from that long list and starting to really apply the threshold and see which topics flow to the top into those areas that are material. And then once you've done that, review that with your team. Look at where do we land with this? Are there any surprises, any insight? Do we need to make any tweaks now or next year? And across this, work with your ESG task force or committee, engage leadership in that review. But the key thing here is to really think about what is your best fit for purpose, repeatable process that mitigates bias as best you can, and that creates comparable outputs. And describe that clearly in your documentation. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about how you potentially could do the IRO scoring, CSRD has some further details. So you can do a bit more of a deep dive into CSRD and look at some of the criteria they said that you can use. How exactly what scores you apply to them is up to you. So it's always useful to look at that to get an insight or inspiration for creating your own fit for purpose scoring methodology. Now, if you have to do CSRD double materiality, definitely make sure you follow the steps from CSRD because that is required. There's still some things you have to figure out on your own or with the help of an expert or a consultant. But in any case, you need to come up with a fit for purpose approach, and it might not be perfect, and that is okay. There's definitely a lot of flexibility. The key thing here is, as long as you describe what you've done, that is more important than, as your teacher said, I don't care you got to the wrong answer, at least we understand how you got there. So there's no right and wrong in doing materiality here, but be transparent and open about how you develop this and ask people around you how they're doing it. So that final stage then is you now have your list with your material impacts, risks, and opportunities and their related sustainability topics. So get ready now to report that. And yes, report the outcomes here and make sure that when you do that, also describe where is that leading to? What are you going to do next? When are you going to run a materiality assessment again? How does this feed into your metrics you're disclosing, your strategy, your resourcing, your focus areas around ESG, any risks that you were or were not aware of? So think about those things and describe that. And as I flagged at the start, this is the time now to really share that, this description of the process you've gone through. And is that clear? And is it repeatable? And what are your thoughts? And what might you change next year? And finally, then, do you have to do assurance? If that's the case, start that process now, provide your auditor with all the documentation. But it's really important to have a chat internally, maybe even in step one, to think about, are we required to have a level of assurance around this? CSRD does require you to do that. And if that is a yes, then make sure that you speak early to your auditor to understand their requirements, that you don't have to reverse engineer the process when you get to the end. Make sure that if you're required to do a level of assurance, that you take your auditor at the start and say, this is the process we're planning to go through. Are there any additional components or steps we need to take to make sure that your job is easier or can be done at all at the end? Now, realize these 4 steps, there's still a lot of detail you need to work out there. And that is quite normal. These are some of the steps you might follow. You might follow them in a slightly different order. You might move things around, and that is fine. If you really want to learn a little bit more about some of those scoring components, look at CSRD.